What is up, YouTube? I'm Devon DaVinci, leader of the Renaissance crew, and you're watching DaVinci Reacts. Today we have part 3 of Extra Credits video, the first Opium War. Well, the series is called Extra History. Let's jump into it and see what it has to offer. The last episode, I believe, talked about... Well, I remember it. It pretty much talked about how the British were able to get opium into China and the different channels they had to go through to get it smuggled in. And well, let's be real, he was a prosecutor. The prosecutor that the Chinese emperor appointed to get opium out of the country. And it eventually led to a battle near Hong Kong that led to, or that is leading into the actual war. But with that being said, let's jump into this and see what it has to offer.
Guns had been fired, lives had been lost, but full-scale war wasn't a certainty yet. The British set up a blockade. The Chinese were offering to let British captains dock so long as they signed a bond saying that they would never sell opium in China and were willing to be subject to Chinese law. But the British had already put out the order. No British ship was to trade with the Chinese. Tensions are high. Something would have to give.
Something I do notice is around this time, Britain was getting into a lot of rather large wars. I mean, say what you will about the United States. Most of our wars tend to be against much smaller countries. Now, you can say that's good or bad, whatever the hell you want. I mean, well, war is bad to begin with, but around this time, it's like Britain has been just fighting just the elite like elite nations. Like they fought France, and then I mean technically the colonies in the United States wasn't a major war, but they were fighting against China, and then they were fighting some pretty big goddamn wars around this time.
On the 3rd of November, 1839, a British ship by the name of the Royal Saxon approached Canton. They were signaled to stop, to turn back, but they made a run for it. One of the British ships in the blockade fired a warning shot. It skipped past their bow. The cannon shot was heard from the shore. The Chinese admiral stationed at Canton made his decision. He would send out his fleet to protect the Royal Saxon. And so a small host of junks and fireships began to pour out of the Canton harbor. The situation was confused. The commander of the ship that originally fired requested permission to engage. Captain Elliot, the superintendent of British trade and the man who'd convinced the British merchants to hand over their opium in the first place, initially wavered, but the Chinese ships were bearing down hard. Another request to engage was made. The Chinese ships were festooned with red flags, the color of war. The honor of his nation and his flag would not allow Elliot to back down before such intimidation. The order was given, and the men engaged. The first broadside roared over the water. British shells shredded one of the fire rafts. There was a cataclysmic explosion, a gout of flame and sea.
What exactly is the purpose of a fire raft? I'm guessing to bump into the other ships and catch them on fire. I mean, this was still the time when all ships were pretty much wooden, so it would be effective. But I'm just assuming, am I right?
One of the war junk's magazines had been hit. All that was left of it were burning planks carried by the waves. The ships turned to give another broadside, but the outmatched Chinese junks began to retreat. Only the proud admiral's flagship was left, standing defiantly, returning shot. But it was hopelessly outclassed and already damaged. Seeing the admiral standing alone, Elliot told his captains to cease fire. The point had been made, there was no need for meaningless slaughter. And so, seeing the ceasefire, the flagship turned and limped back to port. The first real battle of the Opium Wars had come and passed, with the British bombarding the Chinese forces for defending a British ship which they themselves had originally fired on. For some time after this, there was a lull. Some in China even thought that the British were too far away to seriously pursue a war. But the truth was, the British were simply mustering their forces. At that very moment, Marines and soldiers from India were being redeployed and transported to China. The latest ships were dispatched from British naval yards to serve in the fight. Many in the British Admiralty saw this as an excellent opportunity to field test the iron, steam, and sail ships that were just rolling off the lines. When the forces arrived, though, the British descended on the island of Tucson. The Chinese and British officials met, once on the Chinese flagship, once on the British ship. Each time, the British made their demands clear: surrender the island and no one will be harmed. And each time, the Chinese responded in baffled disbelief. The Chinese officials told the British that, hey, we never did you any harm. It's not right to punish us for the acts of those in Canton. They implored the British to turn away, but the British had their duty, and as the Chinese officials made clear on their way out, so did they.
I love how expressive the animations in this, or the illustrations in this video are, because I don't know, it's sometimes making me kind of tough doing proper, like expressing emotion. Or at least for me, it can be tough expressing emotion in a lot of drawings. But with like just something as simplistic as, not necessarily a stick figure, but I'll say a little bit more like a Rayman style animation. They did a good job of making the characters like cartoony expressive, or express themselves in a cartoony manner.
The next morning, the bombardment began. Soon the Chinese forces retreated behind the walls of their city, and the British Marines landed unopposed. They set up their guns and then took the night to rest. By the next day, they found the city nearly deserted. Chusan had been captured with little loss of life, and the British had a jumping-off point for their operations should they decide to threaten Shanghai. By this point, the emperor had dismissed Lin Zexu, the righteous minister who he had so celebrated a short while before, and replaced him with an official named Qishan, who was empowered to treat with the British. Qishan and Elliot began to discuss a settlement. They haggled over reparation for the destroyed opium, and eventually came to a figure of £6 million. But Elliot was still supposed to get territory for the British Empire that they could use for a port. He offered to return Chusan in exchange for some other island, but Qishan was not about to give away portions of sovereign China, and so the talks broke down. Then, as the new year passed, at least for the English, an opium runner, which had snuck its way into Canton, came back with the rumor that the emperor intended to resume the war and attack the British. Elliot decided to preempt such an assault, though the wisdom of trusting unsubstantiated rumors coming from opium runners is a bit questionable. Really, it's unlikely that such an attack was ever actually in the works. But working with the information he had, Elliot commanded the British forces to open fire on the Chinese fortifications at Chuenpi near Canton on the morning of January 7, 1841. The fighting lasted mere hours. The British guns ripped through the fortifications and silenced any counter-batteries with haste. Then, Indian and British Marines landed and rapidly pushed the Chinese ground forces back. Tragically, a rumor had been circulating among the Chinese that the British executed every prisoner they captured, and so many hopelessly fought on to the death, until their battalions were in tatters and their dead outnumbered their living. By 11 in the morning, the British flag flew over the Chinese battlements. 600 Chinese lay dead, a meager 100 were captured. Among the British, only 30 were wounded, and those not even from enemy fire, but because of their pieces of artillery overheating and exploding. Meanwhile, the Nemesis, the iron steam and sail ship that was being tested in Chinese waters, demonstrated the power of its guns and rockets, dispatching junks and chasing away the Chinese fleet. 3 further forts stood to be captured, but the next morning, a Chinese physician came under flag of truce to ask on behalf of Qishan. Despite the overwhelming desire of the troops to cut their way to Canton, Elliot acquiesced. Horrified by the slaughter he had just witnessed, he wrote to one of the British trades who was pushing the war that he hoped to resolve it without further bloodshed, and that if further conflict was necessary, it was clear that they could take what they wanted. So he agreed to meet. Soon, terms were hammered out. The Chinese would pay $6 million in reparations. The British would pay $6 million to buy the island of Hong Kong. Ambassadors would be exchanged, the Chinese agreed to not call the British tribute-bearing barbarians anymore, and the British would return all the forts and the territory that they had taken during the war. And most importantly, trade would resume in a much more free and open manner. So, problem solved. The Chinese get just about the best terms they could conceivably hope for under the circumstances, and the British get to fulfill their mission and open up a whole new empire for trade. There's been some bloodshed, but in the end, everybody's happy, right? Well, not exactly. Elliot's boss back in England, a fellow named Lord Palmerston, who will undoubtedly crop up in other episodes down the line, was not happy. The British Empire didn't get the massive sum of money he wanted as reparations for the opium that was destroyed. They didn't get to keep the territory that they'd conquered. They didn't get as many open ports as he would like, and perhaps most of all, he was livid that Elliot, who had never really been comfortable with the drug trade in the first place, didn't even ask that opium be legalized in China. So, Elliot, for his swift and nearly bloodless execution of the war, was dismissed and sent packing. And Qishan, the emperor had to be ecstatic with these terms, right? I mean, the Chinese were clearly outmatched, and at the end of the day, all they had had to cede was a barren rock in the middle of the ocean. Pretty good deal, right? Well, the emperor was not so happy. In fact, he immediately recalled Qishan and ordered him executed for treason.
Oof.
Apparently, he thought they could have gotten a better deal. Don't worry, Qishan lived, he's fine, but needless to say, neither party ever signed this treaty. So join us next time as all the voices of reason are removed from the Opium War.
Okay, so the next video is going to be just straight up death. Right, that's when the actual war happens. That's a shame. The people that wanted to resolve it peacefully were the ones that were dismissed in this episode, or this video. And not to mention the fact that this is called the First Opium War, so it's likely there are some more that are going to happen at some point. I truly don't know what to expect. Like I said, I don't know a lot about this particular event in the history, so I'm going about it, hearing this the first time. So I don't really know exactly like too much to add to it. Like, I'm trying to think maybe the stuff that I could get from it. Who would I consider to be right and wrong? In these situations, it's tough to figure out who's right and wrong because both sides have done things that I guess you could say it puts them both in a bad light. China being very stubborn and unflexible, and Britain being very, what's the word I could describe Britain? Greedy? Like, they had to get, I mean, I know that they were desperate with money because their treasury was pretty much shot after all the wars and stuff they had, but they try to peddle opium on Chinese in order to get them to buy it off of you so you can make money that way. That's kind of, well, not kind of, that's pretty damn bad. Like, you pretty much made your nation a very prominent drug dealer in hopes of gaining money. It's like, yeah. Well, at the end of the day, hubris and ego is what led to the actual bloodshed, and it's only going to get worse because of it, because now we're about to get into an actual 100% war. And I would imagine at this particular time, China might not be able to match Britain as far as technology, but much like the Russians in World War II, I'm willing to bet even at this particular time, China still had a pretty big population. And they had an emperor that they served who was, based on what civilians thought was someone that was directly connected with something divine, they probably would be willing to go a little bit further to fight for their emperor than the British were willing to fight for their king. Let's just put it that way. So they would have the numbers and the whole never surrender thing. I think they're more likely to fall under that than the British. A lot of Asian countries in general have this very strong. What am I looking to say? Asian countries, like, their histories have pretty much shown that when it comes to like surrender and giving up and stuff like that, they don't do that. That's just not a part of them. It's like, if you want to fight with an Asian country, you're going to be in it for the long haul until peace is negotiated or until one of the countries has completely been obliterated. Like, that's pretty much what you're dealing with. It is admirable, though, having that much pride and like this whole honor code. You don't really see too much of it nowadays. No, you don't see too much of it nowadays in a lot of places. hell, sometimes even Asian countries don't even have it anymore. It's like, I don't know, is that like something that kind of went away over time? Nowadays, countries are getting more westernized, so it's like that mindset isn't really a thing anymore. I think World War II also played a bad part in it with the whole um, kamikazes with the Japanese and the with the Nazis and the whole I was just following orders stuff. I think the whole like blind loyalty, never surrender, never give up, always push forward with your country's goals no matter what the cost. I think the reputation for that kind of died, and that's what led to everybody going, you know what? Maybe it's okay to relax and accept defeat every once in a while. But with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Um, I'm just talking out my ass. I might have said something that, for all I know, is completely wrong. If it is, just let me know in the comment section. I look forward to seeing what you guys have to say. I will keep an eye out for it. I am Devon DaVinci. Hopefully you've been a little more enlightened. I certainly have. I will see you on a future video. And until then, I'm going to give you the deuces, and I'm signing out. Deuces.